In my book, Voyage to Mars, which came out about 10 years ago, I was following a group of very, very dedicated scientists who were part of the MOLA team, the Mars Orbiter Laser Altimeter for Mars Global Surveyor, which, as you remember, was in the late 90s, and for a good part of the past decade, was orbiting Mars and sending back a tremendous amount of data from a series of instruments. And I was just following the team assigned to one instrument, the laser altimeter, and involved in their very intense, very, very passionate discussions. This island off the coast of Iceland, Surtsey, it's considered a Mars analog because it is so new. It was created by a volcano only a handful of years ago, and therefore resembles Mars in many geographical ways. And I went there with a member of the MOLA science team, Jim Garvin, who is now the chief scientist out at Goddard. We went there together and walked up that volcano, and as Jim pointed out, Mars-like features with his characteristic enthusiasm. And I got my first taste of some of the convictions and some of the soaring aspirations and romanticism of some of the Mars scientists, which was the equal or greater to anything expressed in a Ray Bradbury novel or short story. Much of the scientific background of the reality of Mars was conditioned by this image, which was then over 30 years old. And at this point, Mars had been stripped of virtually all its romance. And instead of being the red planet of Ray Bradbury or Lowell or others, was considered the dead planet, perhaps as dry and as lifeless as the moon. So the idea of going to Mars and finding any signs of water, liquid, potential breeding ground for life or anything else seemed highly unlikely and speculative. But then jumping ahead a little more than 30 years to this image, Pathfinder is in 1997, shows how dramatically that paradigm had changed. The revived fascination in Mars for its scientific possibilities and, to a lesser extent, its romance became apparent, and somewhat of an obsession in the Mars program at NASA. As Jim was fond of saying, and as many of the scientists were fond of saying, Mars is back, and it was back in a big way, and it's still back. It's always going to be back as our neighboring planet. Pathfinder demonstrated a novel landing system, the entry, descent, and landing system, the bouncing ball across the surface of Mars. And it also demonstrated the viability, or re-demonstrated the viability of robotic exploration of Mars. You can see the little rover there. And this, of course, had tremendous implications for future exploration of Mars. And what we're seeing now for the way Mars would be studied as the robots became in effect, mechanical scientists roving to a certain extent at will across the surface of Mars and able to do what stationary spacecraft couldn't do before. Only 7-8 years later, MER, Mars Exploration Rover, was able to produce this spectacularly detailed, you can't really appreciate it all in this image, panoramic landscape of Mars. To give you an idea, this is now only 30-something years after the Mariner, less than 40 years, after that fuzzy black and white Mariner flyby image of Mars. The fantastic resolution of these images, of these digital images, was becoming better than the human eye could see. There were more components that could be analyzed. They were more accurate. Nevertheless, Mars Global Surveyor kept circling Mars, and the scientists who remained with it year after year after year kept perfecting the cameras and the instruments and the laser altimeter, and the data that they sent back as the orbit was gradually perfected became more and more detailed, higher resolution. This is a composite of many mapping orbits, false color, of course, with the crater Hellas in the lower right. And after a while, the surface of Mars was mapped in greater detail than the surface of Earth by this and other spacecraft circling Mars because of the virtually no atmosphere, no current oceans, of course, or vegetation, allowed what is really an extraordinary thing to happen, which was this highly detailed mapping of another planet. There's another view of the Hellas crater. Again, one of the extraordinary images for Mars Global Surveyor. the MOLA instrument was mapping Mars, but it was also looking for signs, potential signs of ancient water on Mars, and potential landing sites for other spacecraft on Mars. So it was linked in to other missions. This began my thinking about exploration and discovery and drawing analogies between what NASA was doing now in the age of exploration in the 15th century and early 16th century. And I began thinking about rovers and what comparisons could be made to classic explorers such as Christopher Columbus. That led, after Voyage to Mars, to my book Over the Edge of World about Magellan's circumnavigation, which was really inspired by the scientists constantly talking about analogies to Magellan's circumnavigation in 1518 and 1521. And by the 10th or 15th time that someone mentioned it, I thought that might be an interesting subject for a book. And at the moment, I'm writing about Columbus's 4 voyages. And in working on it, I became aware of something called the Columbian Exchange, which is another way of saying the law of unintended consequences. The Columbian Exchange was first explored by Alfred Crosby. That made me wonder now, what will be some of the unintended consequences, good or bad or indifferent, of our exploration of Mars, of NASA's exploration of Mars. I don't have any answers for that one yet, or even theories, but now that it's been going on for 40 years, it's time to begin to think about what we know what we're doing, and we know what we say we're doing, and there are tons of position papers about that, but what are things that might be happening that we're not aware of? And it wouldn't be as simple as spreading germs or bacteria, and it might be things that really don't fit into our categories of thought today and might evolve over time. Meanwhile, as NASA fulfills this quest, the robotic population of Mars, to say nothing of its skies, has grown, and there's some suggestions in white of places that we need to visit. So we now have a legacy of several decades of robotic spacecraft, many of them still operating on the surface of Mars and working in tandem with other spacecraft circling in Mars. It's only a matter of time until there's a Martian internet, as these spacecraft are able to talk to each other and then convey signals back to Earth. Of course, it won't be like our internet because of the time differences involved in transmitting data over those millions of miles of distance. But Mars is slowly becoming wired. And if you have any questions now, I'll be happy to see what I can do with them. Thank you. Thank you.